There is a moment in a person's life that rarely announces itself with intensity or spectacle, yet it quietly alters the direction of one's thinking in a way that cannot be reversed once fully understood. It does not arrive as a sudden revelation or a dramatic turning point, but rather as a gradual awareness that begins to reshape how one interprets effort, success, and the purpose behind one's actions. For a long time, it is entirely possible to live within the boundaries of personal ambition, to structure one's days around progress, achievement, and the pursuit of a life that appears stable and well-constructed from the outside. This path is not inherently flawed, and in many ways it is encouraged, because it offers measurable results and a sense of forward motion that feels productive. Yet over time, a subtle question begins to take form beneath all of this movement, and it is a question that does not come from dissatisfaction, but from honesty. At some point, one begins to examine whether a life centered entirely on the self can truly sustain a sense of meaning that goes beyond temporary accomplishment. This is not a rejection of ambition, but a deeper inquiry into what remains when achievements lose their novelty and outcomes no longer carry the same emotional weight they once did. It was through this quiet observation that I began to notice a distinction in the way certain individuals carry themselves, particularly those who have chosen a path rooted in service. There is a steadiness in them that is difficult to replicate through personal success alone, a composed clarity that does not depend on recognition or validation, but instead emerges from a consistent alignment with something larger than their own immediate interests. This realization did not arrive at a time when everything in my life felt certain or resolved. In fact, it emerged during a period where clarity was limited and direction often felt uncertain. However, even within that uncertainty, there was an unmistakable understanding that a life driven solely by personal gain eventually becomes restrictive, not because it lacks opportunity, but because it places the entire burden of meaning on the individual. When everything revolves around one's own outcomes, every success becomes fragile, and every failure becomes deeply personal, creating a cycle where one is constantly negotiating with circumstances that are not entirely within their control. Over time, this dynamic creates a form of pressure that is difficult to sustain, because it requires continuous validation in order to maintain a sense of purpose. It was at this point that the idea of being useful began to take on a different meaning. Not in the sense of proving one's worth or constantly seeking approval, but in a more grounded and enduring way, where one's actions contribute to something that continues beyond immediate recognition. This shift in perspective does not diminish personal ambition, but rather reframes it, allowing it to exist within a broader context that is not limited to individual outcomes. Service, when understood in this way, is not an act of sacrifice, nor is it a rejection of personal goals. It is an alignment with a form of purpose that is less dependent on external validation and more connected to the impact of one's presence and actions over time. It introduces a different kind of stability, one that does not fluctuate with every success or setback because it is rooted in contribution rather than comparison. There are, without question, moments where this path feels invisible, where effort is not acknowledged and progress appears slow or uncertain. These moments are significant because they reveal the underlying intention behind one's actions. If the motivation is tied to recognition, it becomes difficult to sustain. If it is tied to identity, it can lead to confusion. However, when it is grounded in a genuine sense of alignment with what feels right, There is a resilience that allows one to continue without the constant need for affirmation. It is important to understand that choosing to serve does not mean losing one's sense of self. On the contrary, it often leads to a clearer understanding of who one is, because it removes the constant need to measure every action against personal gain. It simplifies decision-making in a way that is both subtle and profound, shifting the focus from "what do I get from this?" to "does this genuinely contribute in a meaningful way?" This single shift in perspective has the capacity to reduce unnecessary complexity, allowing clarity to emerge naturally rather than through force. It does not eliminate uncertainty, but it provides enough direction to move forward without hesitation, even when outcomes are not guaranteed. Over time, this way of living builds something that goes beyond confidence, because confidence can fluctuate based on circumstances, while alignment creates a more consistent form of trust. It is a trust in one's direction, in the understanding that even when results are not immediate or visible, the effort itself remains meaningful. This also changes the way one experiences failure. Instead of being perceived as a reflection of personal inadequacy, it becomes a source of information, a way to refine one's approach without losing sight of the larger intention. When the focus shifts from outcome to contribution, failure no longer carries the same emotional weight, because it is no longer the sole measure of progress. What emerges from this is a sense of freedom that is often misunderstood. It is not the absence of responsibility, but rather the presence of the right kind of responsibility, the kind that grounds rather than burdens, and that provides a reason to continue even when motivation is low. There are inevitably days where clarity feels distant and effort seems to lack momentum. In those moments, it is not motivation that sustains action, but a quiet understanding of why the path was chosen in the first place. This understanding does not demand attention or reinforcement, because it exists as a steady presence, one that does not need to be constantly redefined. Ultimately, choosing to serve is not about achieving visible impact on a grand scale, but about consistently contributing in ways that may seem small in isolation, yet accumulate over time into something meaningful. These contributions shape not only the environment around us, but also the way we perceive ourselves and our role within a larger context. This is why I chose to serve. Not because it guarantees success or recognition, but because it removes the constant need for both. It provides a direction that remains steady even when circumstances change, allowing one to move forward without the pressure of constant comparison or validation. In the end, what matters is not how much one gains, but how deeply one aligns with a purpose that extends beyond the self. Because it is in that alignment that a person finds a sense of stability that is not easily disrupted. Real fulfillment begins when your actions are no longer measured by what they return to you, but by how deeply they contribute to something that remains, even in your absence.